The United States is not and will never be at war with Islam. In fact, our partnership with the Muslim world is critical, not just in rolling back the violent ideologies that people of all faiths reject, but also to strengthen opportunity for all people.
In his historic speech at the Turkish parliament in Ankara yesterday, President Obama aimed to overcome widespread resentment in the region for what many saw as the Bush administration's aggressive policies against Muslims and Arabs. The speech, which lasted 45 minutes and covered a wide array of issues, including the Arab-Israeli peace process, was carried by Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and drew favorable responses throughout the Middle East. Welcome to Here on Earth, Radio Without Borders from Wisconsin Public Radio. I'm Jean Feraca. This hour, Noam Chomsky reflects on U.S. Middle East policy. Did you hear President Obama's speech before the Turkish parliament yesterday? What did you think of it? Do you sense a thaw between the U.S. and Muslim-majority nations? Do you welcome it, or do you worry about a possible loss of security? What actions should follow President Obama's rhetoric? To join us on the air, call 1-877-GLOBE-07. Again, that's 1-877-GLOBE-07. Our email address, hereonearth@wpr.org. You can send an instant message on AOL Instant Messenger to Here on Earth Radio, or send a tweet to Here on Earth Show, and that's one word. With me in the studio this hour is Professor Noam Chomsky. He's an American linguist, a philosopher, a cognitive scientist, a political activist, and such a prolific author that he's not quite sure what the title of his latest book is. He's also a professor emeritus of linguistics at MIT. Noam Chomsky, it's a real pleasure to welcome you here.
Very glad to be with you.
You're here for a series of lectures that you've been giving, among other things, focused on human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, and especially on health issues there.
Well, actually, the people who are speaking about health issues are people who've actually worked on them. Rita Giacaman, who's a health worker, physician from the West Bank, from Ramallah, and Graham Watt, who's British, who's worked extensively on health issues in the occupied territories, and I'm there partly to listen, partly to fill in some background.
President Obama did mention the Israel-Palestine situation in his speech yesterday, saying that the United States strongly supports the goal of two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security. That is a goal shared by Palestinians, Israelis, and people of goodwill around the world. That is a goal that parties agreed to in the roadmap and at Annapolis. And that is a goal that I will actively pursue as president. Both Israelis and Palestinians must take the steps that are necessary to build confidence. How do you respond to that message?
Well, there's a couple of striking omissions that should be filled in. First, it's not just Israelis and Palestinians who have to build confidence, but it's primarily the United States. The United States has to act in such a way that will build confidence. And there is a history which he ignores. The history is that for over 30 years, the U.S. and Israel have unilaterally blocked a diplomatic settlement that the rest of the world agrees to. And has agreed to for a long time, and that is exactly a two-state settlement. What he fails to mention is where that two-state settlement will be. So even the most reactionary nationalist Israeli politicians, you say, okay, two-state settlement, but for the Palestinians it'll be some scattered cantons that they can call a state if they want, but won't be viable. Now, he's very carefully omitting that. There's another crucial omission, and the U.S. has blocked the settlement up until now, and everything he said indicates he intends to continue with that policy. Now, he says that everyone agreed to the roadmap. That happens to be incorrect. Israel formally signed the roadmap, but immediately added 14 reservations, which almost completely eliminate its content, and the U.S. backed them. So the U.S. and Israel don't accept the roadmap. As far as the Annapolis meeting is concerned, decisions are concerned, they were pretty vague. But the current foreign minister of Israel, in his first pronouncement after his appointment, said that Israel is not bound by Annapolis. So there are some critical gaps, the most important one being the absence of a recognition of what the U.S. role has been for over 30 years and his own intentions with regard to perpetuation of this role.
And to add to what you just told us about Prime Minister Netanyahu, Israel's new foreign minister, Avigdor Lieberman, declared Wednesday that those who wish for peace should prepare for war, and that Israel was not obligated by understandings on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict reached at Annapolis, that is the American-sponsored peace conference in late 2007.
Yeah, and Lieberman added that the U.S. is bound by the roadmap, failing to point out that Israel had instantly added reservations which undermine the roadmap, to which he is committed.
Syria, in particular, was elated by President Obama's speech, especially with regard to his pledge to pursue a two-state solution in the Middle East, even going so far as to assume that that two-state solution would have Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestine state. I think that's hardly likely, but what impresses me about that response is that that it is coming from Syria, a state that former President Bush, labeled as part of the axis of evil, and that it seems to suggest that Middle Eastern countries are ready to assume that President Obama really is holding out an olive branch and plans to do something tactical about the problems of the Palestinian territories.
Well, President Obama, during his campaign and since, has shown an absolute genius in speaking and acting in such a way that people will draw their own favored conclusions from it. His typical style through the campaign has been essentially to present himself as a kind of a blank slate on which you write your wishes and hopes. So very careful to avoid dealing with the specific issues and taking a rhetorical stance of friendship, hope, change, partnership, and so on. And yes, it's very easy for people who have been kind of under the lash to think, well, maybe something good is coming. Over and above that, you should expect the leadership of every state to welcome whatever is said by the master of the world. You know, you want to be on the good side. So the Syrian leadership, which is not necessarily Syria, it's a dictatorship. So it's not necessarily the popular response, but the leadership will, of course, welcome what sound like accommodating statements from the leader of the world's sole superpower, and will hopefully add their own interpretation to it. But he has said nothing about what matters. Where are the two states? George Bush was in favor, said, we're dedicated to a state settlement. Where? The United States continues to act in a manner which undermines the possibility of a two-state settlement. So, for example, right at the moment, Israel is extending settlements in the occupied territories. The most recent event was essentially throwing out Arab settlers in a critical area of Jerusalem and replacing them by Jewish settlers. That was harshly condemned by the European Union. But all the Obama administration said is it's unhelpful. Well, that's not going to exactly frighten the Israeli government. And while not criticizing it except in a meaningless way, the U.S. also continues to subsidize it. Okay, as long as that continues, the words wouldn't mean anything even if they were definite, but they're kept crucially indefinite. For example, will the just let me give you a concrete example. Obama has in fact made one declaration on Israel-Palestine. It was in the press conference where he introduced George Mitchell as his emissary. He did refer indirectly to the two-state settlement. He said there is one constructive proposal which we really should take seriously, the Arab League proposal, which in fact reiterates the long-standing international consensus that the U.S. has blocked. It calls for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, maybe some minor modifications. And it says that in that context, a two-state settlement, the Arab states will proceed with normalization of relations with Israel. Okay, Obama's correct to say that's a significant statement. But notice the gloss that he gave to it. He said, yes, it's a very constructive statement. The Arab states should proceed to normalize relations with Israel. Well, that wasn't the Arab League proposal. The proposal, as he knows, was to reiterating the international consensus, the view of the world, two-state settlement on the international border, and in that context, normalize relations. Well, by eviscerating the proposal, he gave a pretty clear indication that he expects the U.S. to maintain its rejectionist program. And it is unilateral. I mean, just about everyone accepts this, even Hamas, Iran, Europe, the non-aligned countries, and Palestinians. And that's been true for over 30 years, with a few exceptions. If we had time, we could go through the exceptions. But it's basically been true. And he said nothing to indicate any change in that.
Well, he said nothing yet. As we all know by now, he's a very careful politician. He chooses his words very judiciously, and he's the fact that he managed to please both secularists and Islamists in Turkey, I think, testifies to that. What do you think of the choice of Ankara as a place for him to deliver this speech?
Well, let me just say a word on his ability to please all sides. That he's notorious for that. Last summer, I think it was July, he visited Israel, and there were statements by the various people he visited, like Shimon Peres, who's regarded as a dove, whatever that means, said, he was very happy. Obama agreed with him about everything. And Benjamin Netanyahu is regarded as the hawk, said, delighted. We had a great conversation. He agreed with me about everything. And one of Israel's leading correspondents, I think it was Aleph Ben, wrote an article in the main paper saying, well, yeah, that's Obama. He talks to you in such a way that he's friendly and outgoing, and he makes you think he agrees with you. But these two people are at sword's points on everything. He couldn't have agreed with both of them. It's just he made him feel that way. And, yeah, that's pretty much what the campaign has been and his presentation has been. Why meet in Ankara? Well, Ankara is a critical country from the point of view of U.S. strategy. It's been a major ally since the Second World War. In fact, it's part of what's sometimes called the peripheral system that the United States had set up to control Middle East oil resources. It's major U.S. military bases are in eastern Turkey. It's a Muslim country, but basically secular, and has had a close alliance with Israel since 1958. And it was part of the Israel-Turkey Saudi, Iranian, before the Shah fell, alliance, basically aimed at controlling the region. It did have a serious falling out with the United States in 2003.
Yeah, because they refused to allow a path through the country to Iraq.
That's right. I mean, Turkey was very bitterly condemned in 2003, as you'll recall, because the Turkish government followed the will of 95% of the population. And
We
refused
need to
follow.
take a break right there. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Noam Chomsky with us this hour, talking as he has been wont to do these many years, critically about American foreign policy, and in particular about the new policies as stated outright by President Obama, or maybe not so outright. We're at 1-877-GLOBE-07 if you'd like to join the conversation. Our email address here on earth at WPR.org. I'm Jean Feraca.
North Korea broke the rules once again by testing a rocket that could be used for long-range missiles. This provocation underscores the need for action, not just this afternoon at the UN Security Council, but in our determination to prevent the spread of these weapons. Rules must be binding. Violations must be punished. Words must mean something. The world must stand together to prevent the spread of these weapons. Now's the time for a strong international response.
That's another clip from President Obama, this time speaking over the weekend in Prague on the rocket launch that actually failed, but was attempted by North Korea. Noam Chomsky, those words of President Obama's, strong words.
Not really. He proposed no strong actions. And there are also many questions that one might ask. Maybe North Korea is the worst place in the world. You could make a case from that. But is sending a rocket a violation of law? I mean, just a week before, the U.S., or a couple of weeks before, the U.S. had launched a much more powerful rocket to carry a satellite, far more powerful. Well, is that following the rules? Yeah, we think so. In fact, the world thinks so. Does North Korea have a right to try to duplicate that? I mean, according to U.S. analysts, it was a failed satellite launch. Now, nobody wants them to do it who has their brains functioning, because it's true that it could be used as a missile for nuclear weapons. But under what circumstance would North Korea fire a nuclear-tipped missile? Well, there's only two possibilities. One is they have a wish for self-vaporization. If they even so much as mounted a nuclear-tipped missile, the country would be vaporized. So either it's that, or else it's a deterrent. They would like a deterrent against a U.S. attack. And in fact, if you look back at the negotiations over the past years, during the Clinton years, there were negotiations, and they were more or less successful. So it ended with North Korea not having nuclear weapons capacity.
And that was in return for the promise of aid.
The promise of aid, and it was also the promise, an unclear promise of withdrawing the threats, the constant threats. They want security, naturally. Well, when Bush came in, he just undermined all of that, took a very hostile stance, and they immediately started nuclear weapons development. So they ended up with a supply of nuclear weapons and missile development. Well, there was an agreement in, I think, September 2005 that North Korea would stop all of its nuclear weapons development, and in return, the United States would take them off the list of states supporting terrorism. Well, that's a list that says we can attack you if we feel like it, and would give some kind of security guarantees and would allow them to enter into the world, with economic relations and so on. Within weeks, the Bush administration had undermined that, had blocked economic transfers and so on, and they went back to missile development.
Isn't the same thing true of Iran?
Iran is a slightly different case, and the Obama position is interesting. There was a national intelligence estimate, highest level U.S. intelligence estimate in November 2007, which concluded with pretty high confidence that Iran is not following a weapons development program and hasn't been for several years.
Uranium enrichment for energy purposes.
That's what the U.S. intelligence concluded and had been doing so for years. That's within their rights. Most of the world agrees to that. Now, Obama, when he came in, his administration said, well, we reject this intelligence analysis. They said we have no new evidence, but we just reject it. And therefore they talk about what they call Iran's illicit weapons program. They don't tell us why it's a weapons program. They just say it's an illicit program. And they state what you quoted states correctly, that states ought to follow the rules and not develop nuclear weapons. Well, there are some states that have developed nuclear weapons. In the region, the one that's far ahead of anyone else is Israel.
And also Pakistan.
Pakistan has developed nuclear weapons, and the background of that is interesting.
Ronald Reagan.
That was Ronald Reagan, who knew, I don't know what he knew, but his administration certainly knew that Pakistan was developing nuclear weapons, but he regularly denied it so that the U.S. could continue providing massive military aid to the Zia-ul-Haq dictatorship, which was imposing radical Islamization on Pakistan and also developing nuclear weapons. So, yeah, they have them too. And there's another one, India. India developed nuclear weapons in violation of its international obligations, and the U.S. did have sanctions for a while, but they were removed by George Bush, who said, okay, you can have your nuclear weapons and you're now a partner. We'll allow you to get nuclear technology and so on. So sure, it'd be nice if nations followed the rules. There are, in fact, rules that apply to us. So the signers of the Non-Proliferation Treaty pledged themselves to take good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. A large majority of Americans think the U.S. ought to do that.
Who's above the rules?
Anyone with the power. It's not pleasant, but there's a statement by Thuycidies which more or less describes the world, which says the powerful do what they want and the weak do what they must.
We have lots of people who want to join in this conversation. Nicholas is on the line from Racine. Hi, Nicholas.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. Professor Chomsky, first of all, I want to thank you for all the work you've done over the years, both in terms of political economic analysis and linguistics. I don't know where we'd be as a civilization without you. My question is regarding the foreign policy of this presidential candidate, which is probably not too far off from any of the candidates that the Republican Party offered, aside from perhaps Ron Paul. And early on, before the primaries, you had endorsed Dennis Kucinich, and after the primaries, as I recall, you sort of urged progressives to cast their vote for Obama without any illusions that this was going to bring any sort of change. And I wonder whether or not in the next election cycle, if your disillusion with the Democratic Party would finally come through, and you might suggest that progressives mount some sort of third-party attack on the hegemony of capitalism.
Well, actually, disillusion, it's not really disillusion because I had no illusions in the first place. And what I actually said about the 2008 election and previous ones was that people in swing states should vote against McCain and Palin, in my opinion, because there is a difference. It's not a huge difference, but there's a difference between the two parties. And those differences, though not huge, translate into pretty large effects in a powerful system. I myself happen to not be in a swing state, so I felt no obligation to vote for Obama, and I didn't. I voted for a third-party alternative, the Greens. And I think it makes good sense to try to develop an alternative, which is very hard in our system, in part because of the winner-takes-all system, which doesn't allow for what many parliamentary regimes have, partial representation by smaller parties, but in part just because of the enormous concentration of capital that's required to enter into an electoral campaign under the way our system is designed. But yes, I think we should work hard to overcome that. But still, in my opinion, it's often sensible to try to deter the worst.
Thanks for the call, Nicholas. We'll go to Derek in Round Lake next. Hi, Derek.
Yes, I'd like to thank you very much for the show, Ms. Feraca, and also a great honor speaking with Professor Chomsky. As a writer, I often travel around the world to actually try to write about U.S. foreign policies as well as U.S. corporations influence a lot of different countries. And I find it's extremely troubling, specifically in regards to the American media. There's absolute lack of comprehensive coverage of U.S. corporations abroad and how they behave themselves, whether it's a Chevron in Ecuador or a bribe club by General Electric in Brazil, which are actually big scandals over there right now. There's actually pending a lawsuit in federal court in New York for the world's largest contamination and environmental damage done in Ecuador by Chevron's company called Texaco. And there's just total silence of this. And I think it's extremely troubling that why do you think there is that in a democratic system where everybody and his brother should be held accountable, at least there should be some type of degree of transparency. There's just total lack of silence by media on what's really going on, just beyond the U.S. borders.
Well, as I'm sure you and I would agree, it's not total, so you can find things. But you're right, it's downplayed. What would anyone expect from corporate media? I mean, their commitment is to the corporate system. They're part of it. So sure, they behave that way. I mean, it's not 100%. There are very good reporters, and sometimes things leak through. There are other cases going on now. There's a case that just opened involving the murder of Ken Saro-Wiwa, an activist in Nigeria, and it's the Shell Corporation that's being charged with complicity in this case. And maybe there's some reporting, but I haven't seen it. But these are not the kinds of things that strike corporate media as a high priority. They're not in business to undermine the state corporate system.
Apropos, I wonder, I know you've been very critical of the media. What about the loss of newspapers?
It's a serious problem. I don't think newspapers can be replaced by the Internet in a way which will sustain a viable information system. I mean, the Internet does offer plenty of options, offers international options and others, but if the regular media were to disappear, the main source of news and information would go along with it. I am critical of the media and the intellectual establishment and so on. Nevertheless, it's an irreplaceable source of news and information and investigative reporting. You have to read it in a way which overcomes the effect of a distorting prism. But you can do that, and you find out a lot.
What would you recommend to Americans who really want to be in the know and not just looking at the world through a single lens?
Look through it from a lot of lenses. So take, say, the Israeli attack on Gaza. Okay. Now, there happened to be daily reporting from there by a top-flight television network, and most of the world was seeing 24 hours a day reporting from Al Jazeera, which is a very professional network reporting regularly from Gaza. The U.S., it was blocked in the United States, not by law. It's just an array of state corporate decisions effectively blocked it. You could pick it up on the Internet, but people don't do that. It doesn't have the same effect.
Well, but
you could find it.
But Al Jazeera became tainted, it seems to me, when Saudi Arabia stepped in and said, you have to stop reporting the way you're reporting.
And did the U.S. media become tainted when Bush and Cheney stepped in and said you have to stop permitting Al Jazeera to report? Yeah, there are influences and effects, but you can overcome them. And as compared with the world's media, Al Jazeera is quite professional.
I want to ask you a question about being known as one of the great American dissenters. How did the word dissent itself become tainted? Was it because of the U.S. Patriot Act?
No. I mean, the word dissent has always been tainted. So take like the old Soviet Union. I mean, there were dissenters, Sakharov, Solzhenitsyn, others. Were they loved inside the Soviet system? No, I mean, dissent was bitterly condemned and they were punished.
Okay, but you're comparing the American system to the Soviet system. I think there are some differences.
Yes, there are, but sure, like in the United States, dissenters aren't sent to the Gulag or expelled from the country. dissent is treated differently, but it's still condemned. In fact, that goes all the way through history. It's kind of like a historical universal. It's hard to find exceptions. It goes back to classical times, to classical Greece and the Bible. For example, in the Bible, there were dissenters. We call them the prophets.
Do you identify yourself with that tradition, the prophetic tradition?
Well, I wouldn't have that amount of arrogance. But if you look back at the prophets, they were what we would call dissident intellectuals. They were giving geopolitical critique. They were condemning the king for actions that are going to lead to chaos and destruction. They were calling for sympathy and support for widows and orphans and so on and so forth. That's what we call dissident intellectuals. Were they treated nicely? Oh, they were driven into the desert. They were imprisoned, bitterly condemned. Now, there were intellectuals, what we would call intellectuals in biblical times, who were praised and honored, namely the flatterers at the court. Centuries later, they were condemned in the Gospels as false prophets, but not at the time. And that pattern is pretty close to historical universal.
But we were always told that dissent was a great American virtue, that it was enshrined, that the right to be irreverent even has always been something we've held near and dear.
We're told a lot of things, but it's useful to look at the historical record. The abolitionists, for example, were not praised. And they were struggling against a terrible evil. And there were people who, like Helen Jackson, who bitterly condemned the extermination of the indigenous population. They were not praised.
So many young people, when they heard you were going to be on the show, recognize you as a real mentor and a hero. Who were your heroes? Who were the dissenters that made Noam Chomsky Noam Chomsky?
Well, mostly people whose names are unknown. So take, say, the civil rights movement, which is a good example. The person we think of and honor is Martin Luther King, and that's correct. He was a brave, honorable person. But he would have been the first to tell you that he was riding on a wave, not leading it. The wave was created by mostly young people, students, SNCC volunteers, freedom riders, people who sat in at lunch counters and so on, and they created...
And the kids who died in Mississippi.
They're the ones who died.
Yeah.
They happen to be Northerners.
We have to take another break here. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Noam Chomsky, our guest this hour, Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at MIT and great American dissenter. We're talking, among other things, about American foreign policy and whether President Obama is turning the ship of state in a new direction. 1-877-GLOBE-07. I'm Jean Feraca. You're listening to Here on Earth, Radio Without Borders, and we have open lines now for anyone who'd like to join in. 1-877-GLOBE-07.
Well, now, President Obama knows that America needs to calm the down. Because right now we are freaking out. His plan is to turn down the temperature. By calling it the Overseas Contingency Operation, he seeks to turn the war on terror into a simple accounting problem.
I see. So these aren't going to be the only problems that he has to face, though.
No, absolutely not. And that is why he's neutering the language of so many of our problems. From now on, flooding in North Dakota will be called semi-voluntary property baptism. And forest fires are merely extreme wildlife ossification and talking bear employment opportunities.
That's The Daily Show's John Oliver poking fun at the Obama administration's rhetoric and their avoidance of the words war on terror. The words have changed, but have the policies? Noam Chomsky is with us this hour. And we'd like to hear from as many of you as possible. 1-877-GLOBE-07. We're talking, among other things, about President Obama's speech in Turkey yesterday and whether it signals a change in U.S. relations with the Muslim world. 1-877-GLOBE-07 or here on Earth at WPR.org. So, what about this change in the use of the term war on terror to, what is it now? I can't remember.
What about the change? What about the word itself?
The word itself.
Well, first of all, where does it come from? It actually came from the Reagan administration. George Bush didn't declare the war on terror. He redeclared it. Ronald Reagan declared in 1981, he and his administration, that a major focus of U.S. foreign policy would be the threat of international terrorism. They described it in pretty inflated terms, a plague of the modern age, a return to barbarism in our time, and so on. And that would be the focus of their policy, replacing the human rights focus of the Carter administration. And there was there were publications, there was newspaper reporting and so on, talking about the importance of this war on the plague of international terrorism. Well, no one talks about that very much, because it very quickly turned into a major terrorist war carried out by the United States, which led to the death of a couple 100,000 people in Central America, the ripping apart several countries, support for South African apartheid, which killed probably 1.5 million people in the neighboring countries, and various other atrocities. So that's better put away. We'll forget about that war on terror. Now comes along the new war.
Overseas contingency operations.
Right, yeah.
Or now it has an acronym, OCO.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty standard policy. So just take the word defense. In 1947, the United States changed the name of the War Department to the Defense Department. Without reading Orwell, any intelligent person knew that from now on we're not going to be involved in defense. We're going to be involved in war, which also happened to be true before, but at least it was more honest. And you can run through the list of words. As take, say, containment meant expansion. Stability means destabilizing. I mean, it's actually to the point where the mainstream liberal commentator, James Chase, editor of Foreign Affairs, was able to say without eliciting ridicule that the United States destabilized the government of Chile to enforce stability.
No,
and
that's very Orwellian.
See, it makes sense, because stability means obedience, but you don't call it that. So we could destabilize, meaning destroy the government of Chile, to establish obedience. And consistently you have to translate to understand what's happening.
Terrorist attacks themselves have now been replaced with the phrase man-caused disasters.
No, that I haven't heard. But see, take the phrase terrorist attacks. I mean, even that phrase is a phrase of pure propaganda. I mean, after Reagan declared his war on terror, I actually started writing about terrorism, international terrorism, the plague of the modern age. I wrote books and articles about it, as did a few other people. And that was what I was writing was considered absolute anathema. And the reason was I was using the official U.S. government definition of terrorism, the definition that you find in the U.S. Code and in Army manuals. And that's not allowed, because if you use the official definition, it turns out very quickly that the United States is a leading terrorist state. And you can't draw that conclusion.
What about the use of our Predator drones in Pakistan?
Well, Predator drones are just aggression. It's part of it's an instance of the crimes for which Nazis were hanged at Nuremberg. I mean, they committed worse crimes, but the worst one was the crime of aggression. And targeted assassination is also an international crime, and it has consequences. So, for example, a lot of the fighting in Pakistan near the border, in Bajaur province, one of the worst areas, according to militants there, was elicited, or stimulated at least, by a drone attack on a school, which killed about 80 people. Well, they're primitive tribesmen. They don't like that sort of thing, so that led to a reaction. So it's a crime, If people started assassinating leaders of the American government, say, or some other allied government, we'd consider it a major crime. And when we do it, it's just considered some predator drones. What's that?
We have Mike joining us from Appleton next. Hi, Mike.
Yes, am I on?
Yes, you are.
Okay, Professor, I would have so many questions for you, but let me just boil it down to, unfortunately, one. What do you think the Israelis are going to do with regards to Iran? Because it's my feeling that they feel that they're in a very weak position. They have two capabilities. They can use their aircraft, or they can use their very, very accurate Jericho missile systems to take them out.
I'm not a military weapons specialist, so I won't draw any conclusions, but I doubt very much that the Jericho missiles could do much. And as far as using their aircraft is concerned, it's barely imaginable that they could do that without U.S. support. Just take a look at the transit problems. And even if they did use them, it would probably have a minor effect on Iranian nuclear programs. What the Israelis want is for the United States to do it, Big Brother. And the U.S. has made it pretty clear that it's not intending to do it. So last summer, for example, there was a bill was working its way through Congress that was very strongly supported by the Israeli lobby, by AIPAC, and was making some progress. It was calling for what amounted to a blockade against Iran. That's virtually an act of war. The White House indicated that it didn't want it, and it disappeared. For any attack, military attack on on Iranian nuclear facilities will arouse enormous hostility throughout the world, including the region. In fact, even the countries nearby, like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, have shown, in U.S. polls, have said they don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but they'd prefer that to a war.
We have Jacob joining us next from Madison. And again, the number 1-877-GLOBE-07. Go ahead, Jacob.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I earlier today actually heard another interview that you've done, Mr. Chomsky, and you defended anarchy as kind of the basis for your belief system, and I looked it up in my dictionary, and it says the absence of law and order or general state of disorder and confusion. In anarchism is the political theory that individual freedom should be absolute and that all government and law is evil. To understand where you're coming from, I would like you to clarify how you can defend that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wouldn't defend it, but that's not anarchism. There's a rich, long anarchist tradition. If you want to know my views, there's no time now, but I've written extensively on it. I think the core idea of the whole anarchist tradition is that we should investigate social structures from the family to international affairs and see if we can identify structures of hierarchy and domination and subordination and submission. And we should insist that they justify themselves. If they can't meet the burden of proof of justifying themselves, then we should seek to overcome them and develop a more free and just system. That's the core principle of anarchism. I think it's a very good principle. Anarchists have spelled out, of many different stripes, have spelled out in detail the kinds of societies they would like to see. And they're very organized societies, just based on the principle of cooperation and mutual aid and voluntary choice, rather than the principle of submission and domination. But they're not disorganized societies. Part of the long-standing effort to defame attempts to bring more justice and freedom and equality is to condemn the efforts in the terms that you saw in the dictionary.
I'm curious, where do you see hope?
I see hope from many sources. For one thing, there's been a lot of progress. Just take the last, say, several decades. A lot of achievements have been made. This country, for example, is much more civilized than it was 40 years ago. The last election is an example. 40 years ago, you could not have imagined that the Democratic Party would have two candidates, a woman and an African American. I didn't like either of them, but that doesn't matter. It's a change. And that's a change that's reflected all over the society.
All over the world, really.
In fact, it's all over the world, but it's particularly striking here. There's been a significant change. Now, we have not reached the level that you find elsewhere. So, for example, women in top executive positions is not so unusual in the third world, in fact, elsewhere. But here it's something dramatically new. And there's been previous progress. Like, take, say, just keeping the rights of women. Take the rights of women to vote. Well, it took a long time before that was established in the United States.
I thought about that when I voted this morning.
Yeah, but it's been established in other countries, like, for example, Afghanistan, which established that right before we did. So, yes, things can happen, and they're even, we can go further. But there's been a lot of progress, and it's easier now than in the past to struggle for rights and justice because we have a legacy of left for us by our predecessors who carried out hard struggles, which often won. So history gives plenty of reason for hope, but there's another reason, which is almost logic. I mean, you really have two choices. One choice is to abandon hope and therefore help guarantee that the worst will happen. The other choice is to maintain hope, and maybe it'll improve things.
Hope against hope.
Yeah.
We have Kevin joining us next from Milwaukee. Hi, Kevin.
Hi. Am I in there?
Yes, you are.
Hi. My question is about the Earth. We all live on the Earth here, and quite frankly, the Earth's in a dire situation as far as its resources and how we treat it. I don't think we really have time for the arguments about these really petty arguments about race, religion, and economy when the Earth is in such a situation. So I'm wondering, Noam, what can we do as citizens if our governments continue to stall and allow corporations to rape our one and only home, the Earth?
We can do a lot of things, but that doesn't exclude working on race, the economy, peace, and so on. In fact, those are complementary actions. You can't just say, I'm going to fix the Earth and forget about everything else that's going on, like the existence of corporations or hierarchy and domination and war. You have to look at this systematically, and there are a lot of things we can do. So, for example, and you know what they are, as well as I do, maybe better. There are lots of steps that can be taken to develop a sustainable economy that does not contribute any further to the dread consequences of destruction of the environment, and in fact begins to ameliorate them. There are a lot of concrete steps that can be taken, so let's take them.
James is next from Milwaukee. Hi, James.
Yes, Professor Chomsky. It appears that America has been divided among different interest groups, like the military, the police, the bankers, etc. And so whenever an issue is within their domain, they basically have a veto over whatever's going to go on. And so policies that affect everyone, and particularly the weak.
We're very short on time. Please come to the point.
So I'm wondering, what are some of your what strategies would you suggest to sort of counter that, sort of control that, for example, unions and different organizations have over their domains of interest?
What's the alternative to might makes right?
Well, first of all, just to clarify, unions have very little effect. They've been virtually decimated, and the reason is they not only support workers' rights, but they have a democratizing effect. So the real answer is let's create a democratic society in which these decisions are made by the population, not by one or another powerful segment.
Noam Chomsky will be speaking at 7:30 this evening at the Orpheum Theater in Madison, Wisconsin, on assessing the role of U.S. foreign policy, Israeli security, and human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. And for ticketing information, call 255-8755. That's a 2,000-seat auditorium, so you should have a very robust crowd. And I want to thank you so very much for being with us this hour.
Thanks a lot.